Act 1. Where water could kill. In the Middle Ages, thirst was never innocent. The rivers flowed, the wells were deep, the rain came often enough, and yet water was feared. It carried unseen rot, the breath of sickness, the quiet promise of death. To drink it raw was to gamble with one's life. And so across fields and forests, behind stone walls and wooden doors, people turned to another liquid, darker, warmer, alive. They drank what had been boiled, they drank what had fermented, they drank what had changed. In Brackenford, a village pressed low against the edge of a northern forest, the day did not begin with prayer or bread, it began with ale. The morning bell rang faintly from the chapel, its sound swallowed by mist. Smoke rose from hearths, slow and blue. Inside one such house, a woman named Elfwin lifted a wooden cup to her lips and drank without ceremony. The ale was thin, cloudy, barely strong enough to dull the tongue. It tasted of barley and yesterday's fire. Her son, Adric, watched her from the table. He was 12, his hands already rough from the millstones. When she passed him the cup, he drank too, as he had done all his life. No one called this drunkenness, no one called it sin. It was simply how one lived. The ale had been brewed 3 days earlier, in a blackened iron pot that hung above the hearth like an altar. Elfwin had stirred the mash with a wooden paddle worn smooth by years of use. She had murmured words her mother taught her, not quite prayers, not quite spells. No one remembered where they came from, only that they worked. Grain became liquid, liquid became safe, and safety became daily bread. Outside, the village stirred. Men walked toward the fields with cups still in hand. Women warmed ale with herbs, yarrow for the stomach, rosemary for the head. Even the smallest children drank it, watered down until it was barely more than memory. The river lay close, wide and shining in the pale light. No one touched it. They had learned. The alehouse stood at the center of Brackenford, its door warped, its roof patched with moss and prayer. A painted sign hung above it, a crude tankard spilling foam that never quite dried. It was older than the church, older than the Lord's claim to the land. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and breath. Benches bore the marks of knives and years. Cups were shared, wiped on sleeves, passed again. News traveled faster here than anywhere else. A birth, a death, a tax, a rumor of war, all dissolved in drink. The alehouse was where disputes were settled and begun, where laughter grew loud and grief softened its edges, where a man could confess without kneeling and lie without swearing. The priest disapproved, though he drank there himself when the nights grew cold. Moderation, he preached, balance, he warned, but the words faded quickly once the cup was raised. Beyond Brackenford, across the patchwork of kingdoms and broken roads, the story was the same. Ale in the north, wine in the south, mead where honey flowed. Alcohol was not luxury, it was structure. It marked the hours of labor, the boundaries of class, the rhythm of feast and fast. It sealed marriages and funerals alike. It accompanied prayer and profanity with equal devotion. To refuse a drink was to refuse community. Yet already, beneath the surface, something darker stirred. Men drank not only to survive, but to forget. Women brewed not only to nourish, but to earn. Lords taxed the barrel, sensing gold in the foam. And the church watched carefully. For where drink flowed, order softened, and where order softened, fear followed. On that morning, as mist lifted from the fields and the first casks were rolled from cellars, no one in Brackenford spoke of sin or salvation. They drank, and the world, for a little while longer, held together. Act 2. Stone Walls and Living Yeast. If the alehouse was the mouth of the village, then the monastery was its memory. Stone walls rose where forests had been cut back by patient hands. They stood firm against wind and war alike, sheltering men who had turned away from the noise of the world. Within those walls, silence was law, yet beneath that silence, something quietly lived and worked. Fermentation. At St. Aldham's Abbey, the day began before light. The bell rang once, low and hollow, pulling the brothers from sleep. They moved through corridors worn smooth by centuries of feet, their robes whispering like breath against stone. Brother Mathieu walked last. He was older than most, his beard streaked with white, his fingers permanently stained the color of grain and ink. He was not the abbot, nor a preacher of note. His duty lay below ground. The cellar breathed. Oak barrels lined the walls, their hoops dark with age. The air was cool, damp, heavy with a scent that was neither sweet nor foul, but alive. Mathieu paused, as he did every morning, and listened. There was no sound, and yet he knew the ale was working. In the dark, yeast fed and multiplied, unseen and unnamed, transforming boiled grain into something stronger, safer, enduring. Mathieu believed this process to be holy, not metaphorically, literally. God does not act only through thunder. He acts in patience, in warmth, in time. Brewing in the monastery was not indulgence, it was obedience. The rule allowed drink, moderation, always moderation, but the brothers drank daily, ale for labor, wine for mass, stronger brews for feast days and the sick. The water from the nearby stream was boiled before use, then turned to drink. Nothing was wasted. Pilgrims arrived often, thin and footsore, their mouths cracked with thirst. They were offered cups before bread. To deny drink to the weary was a failure of charity. Thus the monastery became a quiet refuge, not only of prayer, but of sustenance. The vineyard lay beyond the walls, sloping gently toward the sun. Younger monks tended it, their hands raw from pruning, their backs bent in silence. Grapes were coaxed from stubborn soil through patience and repetition. Each harvest was a gamble against frost and rot. Wine was different from ale. Ale fed the body. Wine touched the soul. During Mass, Mathieu stood behind the altar and watched as the wine was raised, blessed, transformed. He had brewed it months before, crushing grapes beneath bare feet, his prayers mixing with juice and sweat. This wine would become blood. Not symbolically, not poetically. It was doctrine. And so the cellar held both humility and mystery. Barrels that fed the poor stood beside vessels destined for eternity. The same hands served both. Yet temptation lingered. The chronicles did not speak of it openly, but everyone knew. A sip taken too freely, a brother lingering too long among the casks, a laugh where silence was required. Punishments were gentle at first, fasting, isolation, extra prayers, but the abbey had known worse. Once, decades ago, an abbot had been found asleep in the cellar, his breath sour with wine, his ring fallen into spilled ale. He was removed quietly, sent to another house, his name never spoken again. Holiness fermented slowly. So did failure. Beyond St. Aldam's, monasteries across Europe brewed and recorded. Recipes were written in careful Latin, margins filled with notes on temperature, timing, grain. Knowledge survived here while kingdoms burned. Monks improved storage, cleanliness, consistency. They understood things no peasant brewer could afford to experiment with. They also understood limits. Wine was to be diluted. Ale was to be measured. Drunkenness was sin, not because it involved drink, but because it dissolved reason. And yet, when winter deepened, when famine crept close, when plague bells rang, the rules bent. The sick were given stronger drink. The dying were allowed comfort. The frightened were not refused warmth. Alcohol within the monastery was neither enemy nor master. It was tool, test, and gift. Brother Mathieu died one winter without ceremony. He was found in the cellar, seated beside a barrel, his hands folded, his face peaceful. There was no cup near him. They buried him beneath the floor of the cloister, as tradition allowed, his name carved small. The cellar continued to breathe. The yeast did not stop. And the world beyond the walls pressed on, louder, rougher, and thirstier than ever. Act 3. Smoke, coin, and open doors. Cities drank differently. Where villages sipped and monasteries measured, cities consumed. Their thirst was louder, sharper, edged with ambition and fear. Stone pressed against stone, bodies against bodies, and drink flowed to soften the friction. In the lower quarter of London, not far from the river's bend, taverns stood shoulder to shoulder. Their doors were rarely closed. Light spilled out at all hours, firelight, candlelight, the yellow glow of spilled ale soaking into rush-strewn floors. The sign of the crooked goose creaked in the wind. Inside, smoke blurred faces into shapes, voices overlapped in a constant murmur that rose and fell like breath. The air smelled of sweat, wet wool, grease and alcohol, old and new mixed together. Here, class dissolved for the price of a cup. Sailors fresh from the docks drank beside apprentices with coin in their pockets for the first time. A clerk with ink-stained fingers argued scripture with a butcher whose hands still smelled of blood. Dice rattled on tables scarred by years of use. Drink was the currency of the room. Ale came first, thick, brown, and filling. Wine followed, sharp and thin, often watered, sometimes not. Mead, when it appeared, was sweet and dangerous. The tavern keeper, a woman named Marjorie, watched everything. She knew who paid, who lied, who carried knives. Her authority was absolute within those walls. Disputes ended when she said they ended, or when blood touched the floor. Both happened often. The city authorities feared places like this. Taverns bred talk, talk bred ideas, and ideas, when soaked in drink, turned reckless. Laws were passed limiting hours, setting prices, banning certain songs. None of it lasted. The people needed places where words could fall without consequence. They confessed here, they plotted here, they mourned here. A man could drink away the memory of plague bells, the image of a child carried to the pits. A woman could forget the narrowness of her world for the length of a cup. Drink did not erase pain, it blurred it. And sometimes that was enough. For women, taverns were thresholds. Some, like Marjorie, held power there they could hold nowhere else. She had inherited the crooked goose from her mother, who had inherited it in turn. 3 generations of women had poured drink and kept order with voice and gaze alone. Others were not so fortunate. A woman who drank too freely was marked. A woman who brewed too well was suspect. Rumors followed them, of cheating, of herbs that did more than flavor, of charms whispered into casks. The line between brewer and witch was thin, and it shifted without warning. Marjorie knew this. She kept her recipes simple, her herbs common, her accounts clean. Survival in the city required caution. Outside, the river carried barrels as it carried bodies. Wine from the south arrived in stamped casks, taxed before they were opened. Ale flowed locally, brewed in back rooms and cellars, its quality uneven, its strength unpredictable. Some drank to celebrate, some drank to endure, some drank because the cup was there. When night deepened, songs grew louder, laughter sharpened into challenge. A spilled drink became an insult, a hand on the wrong shoulder became cause. Knives flashed rarely, but fists flew often. By morning the floor would be washed, the blood diluted, the door opened again. The city did not remember, it drank. As dawn approached, the crooked goose emptied slowly. Sailors staggered toward the river. Apprentices vanished into alleys. Marjorie counted coins, her hands steady, her eyes tired. She wiped the tables, wiped the cups, wiped the night away as best she could. Above her, in stone houses and narrow chambers, the city slept uneasily. And beneath it all, in cellars and barrels, the drink waited. Act 4. Cups of Rank and Measure. In the Middle Ages, what one drank mattered almost as much as what one wore. The cup revealed station. In the great hall of Lord Aymon de Valcroix, wine was poured before the bread was cut. Servants moved silently between trestle tables, their eyes lowered, their hands steady. The goblets were metal, pewter for lesser guests, silver for those whose names carried weight. The wine was red and clear, brought from the south at great cost. It had traveled farther than most men in the hall ever would. Its taste was sharp, layered with age and sun, softened by spices that spoke of distant markets, cinnamon, clove, a hint of pepper. This was not drink for thirst, this was drink for display. Each pour reaffirmed order, each raised cup echoed loyalty. To spill wine here was not clumsiness, it was offense. Lord Aymon drank slowly, deliberately. He did not need to hurry. There was always more. Beyond the walls of the manor, in the villages that fed it, ale told a different story. Peasants drank from wood and clay. Their ale was dark, often opaque, sometimes sour. It filled the stomach when bread was thin, warmed the body when winter pressed close. During harvest, ale flowed freely. It rewarded labor, softened exhaustion. During famine, it was rationed, watered, stretched as far as possible. A weak ale was better than none. Children drank it thin, the elderly drank it warm, the sick drank it strong when it could be spared. To the poor, ale was nourishment first, pleasure second. Hierarchy was enforced even in intoxication. A peasant drunk on wine invited suspicion. Wine suggested theft, ambition, insolence. Ale was acceptable, wine was not. A nobleman drunk on ale was mocked quietly. It suggested frugality gone too far, or a lapse in dignity. Drink was language, and everyone knew how to read it. Yet there were moments when these rules dissolved. Feast days, holy days, carnival. On such days, order loosened its grip. Wine spilled into common cups, ale was spiced and sweetened. For a few hours, laughter crossed boundaries that daily life forbade. Masks were worn, names forgotten. The church tolerated this, barely. Excess was framed as release, not rebellion. A pressure allowed to escape so that the vessel would not break. Still, some pressure lingered. In times of war, drink followed the armies. Wine for officers, ale for soldiers, mead when plunder allowed it. Campaigns were measured in barrels as much as in miles. A dry army mutinied quickly. A drunk one lost discipline just as fast. Kings learned this early. Taxes on alcohol funded campaigns, built walls, paid mercenaries. Every cup raised in a tavern carried a fraction of blood within it. The people drank, and the crown counted. In famine years, the contrast sharpened cruelly. While lords debated harvest failures over wine, villages diluted ale until it was barely colored water. Some sold their last grain not for bread, but for drink, because boiled grain might still keep a child alive one more day. Moralists condemned this. They called it weakness, vice, folly. But hunger had no patience for virtue. Alcohol in this world did not merely reflect hierarchy. It enforced it, it softened it, and sometimes, quietly, it mocked it. For all the rules, all the measures, all the cups assigned by birth, drink passed through the body the same way for everyone. It warmed, it dulled, it faded. And when it was gone, the world returned, uneven, unforgiving, unchanged. Act 5. Of Humors, Plague, and the Devil's Warmth. The church spoke often of drunkenness, but rarely of sickness. Illness, in the Middle Ages, was not an interruption of life, it was a companion. It moved through homes and streets with quiet familiarity, settling into joints, lungs, blood. People learned to live beside it, naming it only when it grew impossible to ignore. Physicians spoke of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and of balance. Health was harmony, disease was excess. Alcohol, they said, was heat. Wine warmed the blood, ale thickened the humors, mead softened the mind. Prescribed carefully, drink could restore balance. Taken without measure, it destroyed it. Medical texts advised wine for digestion, for melancholy, for weakness of the heart. Ale was recommended for laborers, the elderly, and women recovering from childbirth. Stronger drink was reserved for pain, to dull it, to cloud it, to make it bearable. Surgeons poured alcohol into wounds. Patients drank before knives were used. Pain did not disappear, but it drifted, as if pushed slightly out of reach. Thus, alcohol became medicine, and thus, medicine became excuse. Preachers warned of the danger. They described the drunkard as a door left open. Through it entered sloth, lust, violence, and the devil himself. Sermons painted vivid images, souls slipping from bodies softened by drink, demons whispering from the bottom of cups. Yet even the priests drank. They drank to steady their hands during burials. They drank to endure long nights of confession. They drank because the body demanded warmth when faith alone did not suffice. Condemnation was easier than abstinence. When plague arrived, all measures failed. It came without warning, without logic. Bells rang until ringing became meaningless. Houses were marked, streets emptied, then filled with carts. In those months, people drank more. Wine was believed to cleanse the body, ale to strengthen it. Spices steeped in alcohol promised protection. Vinegar was carried in small flasks, inhaled, rubbed into skin. Some believed drunkenness itself warded off infection, that sickness could not settle in a body already aflame. Others drank because there was nothing left to protect. Taverns closed officially, then reopened quietly. Monasteries tightened rules, then bent them. Even the strictest houses allowed comfort to the dying. A man with plague on his breath was given wine, not because it cured him, but because it reminded him he was still human. Disease spread through shared cups as easily as through air. No one knew this. They only knew that some survived and others did not. Alcohol blurred cause and consequence. It hid symptoms. It delayed fear. It softened grief. And when morning came, the world was smaller. In the aftermath, moral voices grew louder. They blamed excess, they blamed taverns, they blamed women brewers, foreign wine, old customs. Drunkenness, they said, had invited God's punishment. But God did not answer. The people returned to their cups, more cautiously perhaps, but no less faithfully. For fear demanded comfort, and comfort in that world often came liquid and warm. Alcohol stood at the edge between care and harm, faith and despair. It healed nothing completely. It destroyed nothing alone. It simply remained, available, familiar, waiting. Act 6. Women, Fire, and Bitter Knowledge. Long before brewing became trade, it was care. In villages like Brackenford, it had always been women who brewed. They knew the grain by touch, the water by smell, the fire by sound. They knew when to stir, when to wait, when to throw a batch away without regret. This knowledge passed from mother to daughter, quietly, without ink or seal. Ale was food. Ale was safety. Ale was survival. An alewife's work fed children and steadied households. She was paid in coin, in grain, in trust. Her brewing pot stood close to the hearth, where stories were told, and prayers half remembered were spoken into steam. No one feared this, not at first. Fear arrived with profit. As towns grew and markets hardened into systems, brewing left the home and entered the street. Larger batches meant more coin, coin meant attention, and attention meant rules. Guilds formed, controlled by men who spoke of standards, fairness, purity. Women were excluded slowly, then formally. Licenses were required, measures enforced, fines issued. Alewives were accused of watering their drink, of cheating customers, of hiding profit. Some did, most did not. But accusation did not require proof. A woman who brewed too well became suspect. A woman who brewed differently became dangerous. Her herbs were questioned, her timing watched, her words remembered. The image changed quietly. The brewing pot became a cauldron. The wooden spoon became an instrument. The herbs became signs. Stories spread of women who could sour ale with a glance, who spoiled batches with a whispered word, who brewed drinks that clouded the mind beyond reason. Witchcraft was not always about flight or fire. Often, it was about fermentation. Ale was alive. Yeast was invisible. Transformation happened unseen. These facts unsettled those who needed order to be obvious. In some towns, women were banned from brewing altogether. In others, they were allowed only under supervision. Fines multiplied. Reputations collapsed quickly. A widow who brewed to survive was accused of greed. A midwife who brewed medicinal ales was accused of mixing poisons. A woman without a husband was always suspect. The tavern keeper Marjorie learned this lesson early. She brewed simply, publicly, predictably. No secrets, no rare herbs, no deviation. Safety lay in dullness. When witch trials later burned across Europe, brewing knowledge stood quietly among the accusations. Cauldrons, recipes, control over unseen forces. Many women died not for magic, but for competence. Alcohol had become something to regulate, to fear, to claim, not because it changed, but because power around it did. By the end of the Middle Ages, brewing was no longer care, it was industry, and women, once central to it, stood mostly outside its doors. The drink remained. The knowledge survived, fractured, hidden, remembered. But the fire around the pot no longer belonged to everyone. By the late Middle Ages, drink had become impossible to ignore. It flowed through every level of life, and so did the desire to control it. Kings and councils discovered what monasteries and tavern keepers had always known. Alcohol gathered people. Where people gathered, words followed. Where words repeated, ideas formed. And ideas, once fermented, could not be sealed back into the barrel. Thus, laws multiplied. Hours were restricted, prices fixed, measures standardized, taxes stamped onto casks before they were opened. Inspectors were appointed, often corrupt, always resented. Every barrel now carried the mark of authority. The crown took its share before thirst was quenched. Reformers spoke of moderation with renewed urgency. Some were sincere. They saw drunkenness ruin families, drain labor, invite violence. They preached restraint, not abstinence, for abstinence was impossible in a world where drink was safer than water. Others spoke of sobriety as obedience. A sober subject worked longer. A sober peasant questioned less. A sober city was easier to govern. Drink, they argued, loosened tongues and softened fear. It made men bold enough to imagine change. And imagination, once shared, was dangerous. Yet taverns remained. Doors closed earlier, songs were quieter, but the benches still filled. Men leaned close, voices lowered. Cups were raised not in celebration, but in agreement. Alehouses became places of listening as much as speaking. Here, grievances were named. Here, injustice found words. Here, plans were not made, but allowed to exist. Peasant revolts did not begin in fields or churches. They began in rooms where drink made courage just possible enough to courage. A tax discussed over ale became insult. An insult repeated became anger. Anger shared became action. The authorities understood this too late, or pretended not to. When rebellion came, drink followed it. Barrels were seized, cellars broken open. Wine meant for lords was swallowed by those who had never tasted it before. For a moment, hierarchy collapsed entirely. But rebellion burned fast, and when it failed, punishment was measured and public. Taverns were closed, licenses revoked, owners fined, imprisoned, sometimes worse. Drink was blamed, as if it had lifted the tools itself. In quieter places, reform took gentler forms. Some communities agreed to limit consumption together. Others brewed weaker ales. Some monasteries tightened rules again, returning to earlier restraint. But no movement could undo centuries of dependence. Alcohol was too woven into daily survival, ritual, and memory. You could regulate it, you could moralize it, you could tax it until it bled gold. You could not remove it. By now, something new had begun to appear at the edges of knowledge. Distillation. Stronger spirits, clearer, more potent than anything before. They arrived slowly, almost unnoticed, promising warmth in smaller amounts, power in purer form. The medieval world sensed change even if it could not yet name it. The cup was evolving. As the century turned, the old order strained. Faith fractured. Authority questioned itself. The Middle Ages thinned, like ale watered one time too many. And still, people drank. Not blindly, not innocently, but faithfully. Act 8. Ashes, Echoes, and the Last Cup. The Middle Ages were ending, though no one noticed at first. Stone walls still held monasteries. Taverns still glowed at night. Fields were still worked by hands as rough and patient as they had been for centuries. And yet the world was changing around them, slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably. The brewing pot remained as it always had, over the hearth. Barrels were rolled from cellars. Ale, wine, mead, and distilled spirits all flowed through hands, into cups, into mouths. Each sip carried memory of survival, of ritual, of desire, of caution. Stronger drinks appeared now. Distillation brought warmth in smaller measures. Imported wines were rarer, richer, more expensive. Brewing knowledge spread beyond monasteries, beyond guilds, beyond fear. And yet, some things never changed. People still drank to live. People still drank to forget. People still drank to celebrate what little light existed between frost and famine, between birth and death. In the quiet villages, children still drank watered ale. Mothers stirred mash in iron pots. Fathers carried casks to fields. In the cities, taverns pulsed with voices, with smoke, with movement. Guilds regulated, kings taxed, priests warned, but the drink persisted. It had survived plague, famine, war, sin, and law. It had survived fear, superstition, and the slow erosion of women's hands from the craft. And it would survive them all again. Somewhere in a monastery, cellar, a barrel swelled silently. The yeast, unseen, worked its miracle as it always had. Somewhere a widow poured ale into a cup with the same care her mother had shown decades before. Somewhere a child tasted the thin comfort of barley and warmth for the first time. It was not merely a drink, it was memory, ritual, defiance, and hope. It was humanity. Kings and peasants, monks and alewives, lords and servants, all touched it, differently, and yet the same. Every hand that held a cup joined an invisible chain, linking centuries together in a communion of survival. The Middle Ages ended, but the cup did not. And as long as humans feared thirst, of body or of spirit, there would always be another pour, another warmth, another taste of life. Another sip between the ashes and echoes of the old world.